I'm not particularly a fan of the survival horror genre, or at the very least, I don't play them much. What you're looking at right now is the most amount of Resident Evil I have ever played. With that in mind, you're probably as surprised as I am that I backed the Kickstarter to a PS1-esque survival horror throwback title, Alisa. I don't want to sound like some paragon of virtue or anything, I only gave it about 15 bucks, but I suppose I backed it because it seemed like a well-realized project. Its main and practically only developer, Casper Croes, convinced me that his game had heart, and with such a modest goal set, I was more than happy to pitch a couple of bucks. Worst case scenario, nothing ever comes of this, and I'm out 15 wacky European dollars, not that big of a deal. But a year and a half later, the game is out. I played it, and my hunch was correct. Alisa is a game with a lot of heart. Not just that though, it's a game I'd call great. It's by no means a flawless game. In fact, amongst some of its flaws lies one that almost eclipses the rest. That aside, it was gripping enough to get a relative newbie to the genre to complete it not just once, but twice. I intend on this video being relatively spoiler-free, so I won't divulge much about the story outside of the premise and my general thoughts. Okay? Cool. Alisa has us take control of the titular character, a royal guard who finds herself in a strange place called the Dollhouse after chasing a thief who has stolen confidential blueprints. Throughout the course of the game, more of the Dollhouse's secrets are revealed as Alisa attempts to escape the Dollhouse with the blueprints intact. It's a perfectly fine premise, and I think the prologue leading up to the title drop is an excellent example of the calm before the storm. This little town is quiet and comfy. The Dollhouse itself seems to have little breadcrumbs peppered throughout to explain the why and how, but there's plenty of questions that feel as though they should have been answered by the end, but weren't. The story feels as though it's there out of obligation at times. That said, I would like to know more about the Dollhouse since it's quite the sprawling, varied location. It felt like every couple of rooms of design style would get turned completely on its head, and I mean that in the good way. I felt like I was seeing something new all the time. There's a general through line to a lot of the locales, but it also isn't afraid to get a little out there. Exploring the Dollhouse is also pretty engaging, thanks in part to those visual flares, but also due to the frequent peppering of consumables and lore bits. There are a few hiccups in the way the game leads you through the Dollhouse, though. One in particular occurs after defeating the first boss, where you're sent to a completely new area of the Dollhouse only to have to backtrack to the location you were just at to progress. And once you're near the end of the game, I think the Dollhouse starts to lose a bit of its luster, because the final main quest of the game requires quite a bit of backtracking to be done across the entire map, and unless you've been incredibly stingy with your ammo pools, most obstacles have been eliminated by that point. There's no respawning enemies. I think it would be pertinent to add some sort of new roadblock during this home stretch to make this section of the game more memorable. Oh, and let me unlock this door from the opposite side, please. The performances by the voice cast is all over the place as well. While Alisa herself delivers a very stilted performance, I actually didn't mind it. Her voice felt similar to those you would hear in those games back in the 90s.
The dollhouse? No, really? What's going on here? And why am I very distressed?
What is it?
Watch out! It's a monster!
Let me take care of this. What is it?
Kenneth was killed too. Maybe by this creature.
If every voiceover in this game felt that way, I probably wouldn't be bringing this up, but some of the talent delivered a perfectly decent performance that felt as though they missed the memo.
To take my throne, aren't you? Let's see what you're made of.
If you're actually watching this video and not just tabbed out or listening to it in your pocket, if you are, it's okay, then you probably notice that there's something in the way Alisa moves. The telltale sign of tank controls.
Audio Jungle.
Alright, hang on, relax. I know that for some, tank controls are an archaic control scheme that should have stayed in the 90s. They have an incredibly high learning curve if you're used to modern controls, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is a deal breaker for some to learn that this is the only way to control Alisa. For now, anyway. Casper Croes intends to add a more modern control scheme at some point in the future. In the meantime, though, it's tank controls or bust. I think it makes sense for Alisa to be controlled this way, since it was not only how a majority of 3D games controlled back then, but practically every survival horror game used tank controls. Director of Resident Evil Shinji Mikami even went so far as to claim that the limited control over the player character led to the game feeling scarier. There's logic to this reasoning, without a doubt. If you can't control your character exactly how you want to, it's harder to avoid the major threats of the game. I don't think I need to explain this further to you. With all that said, Casper should make the modern control scheme his top priority for post-launch support. I understand that tank controls are a part of the game's retro identity, but my initial playthrough of Alisa was rife with struggle thanks in no small part to these tank controls. I adapted, and my second playthrough took less than half the amount of time to complete when compared to my first, but there were plenty of moments that I was cursing the restricted tank controls. Besides, even the original Resident Evil's remake gives players an option to use modern controls. Tank controls will always be something players are fighting against. Despite me adapting, they never became second nature. Perhaps I'd be more forgiving towards the tank controls if the game wasn't so difficult. This game touts on the Steam store page that it has a Soulsborne-like difficulty. Unpacking exactly what Soulsborne difficulty means is beyond the scope of this video, but as someone who has played both Alisa and Souls games, I believe what Casper is attempting to convey here is that Alisa is a game that is tough by virtue of rewarding patience, resource management, and pure physical execution. On paper, both Alisa and the Dark Demon Blood games are similar, but Alisa lacks one major difference, and that comes from the final bullet point: physical execution. Fighting enemies in Alisa isn't like any Souls game, obviously. Rather, enemies in Alisa are best handled by stun-locking them before they can even land a hit on you. Hang on, maybe it is like Dark Souls. This is actually easier than you might expect after some practice, but maybe not easy enough. Before continuing, I would like to give Alisa props for giving our character a melee weapon in a survival horror game that isn't a complete joke. In fact, the saber might just be the smartest purchase of the game's currency, tooth wheels, in the entire game. You'll literally earn the money you spent on it back in no time by using it to kill a large amount of foes. And you'll thank me for this, since this game is pretty damn frugal when it comes to those tooth wheels. Every enemy drops a certain amount, usually tied to how difficult they were to kill. It's a good incentive to actually fight and kill the enemies you encounter in this game, but it's not without its problems. For one, tooth wheel supplies practically dry up near the home stretch of the game, since enemies don't respawn, and by the end of the game the only ones that are left to kill are the ones you really can't fight without losing health in return. Health is something of a currency too, since the more you're hurt, the more first aid kits you're going to want to buy with your tooth wheel, so it's best to just stick to your saber whenever you can. For some enemies, it just isn't feasible to kill with your melee weapon though, and that's where the guns come in. You have a fairly standard, if somewhat limited selection of guns to use throughout the game. However, there's one major feature that results in another hurdle for players to overcome, and that's the lack of an auto-aim. You have to manually adjust Alisa's position while ready to land shots on targets. On one hand, I think that this, in theory, adds a layer of physical execution that is usually missing in the combat of these 3D survival horror games. On the other hand, in reality, all this does is make it even more awkward to fight enemies with any semblance of dexterity. In addition, many enemies are capable of stun-locking Alisa for a period of time, due to her not having any invincibility frames. This in particular strikes me as unfair, and I think it should be changed somehow. The lack of an auto-aim may have been frustrating at times, but I can at least respect it as a design decision. Getting comboed to death, on the other hand, isn't so nice when you're on the receiving end. I should make it clear though that, in spite of all these issues, I still found enjoyment in the gameplay. Something I looked forward to the most was returning to the shop with my new cache of tooth wheels, not purchasing a new weapon, but a new dress for Alisa. All of the dresses come with a specific suite of abilities, which can be helpful. Of course, some dresses are more useful than others. The Royal Guard uniform strikes me as the most useful of them all. But the real appeal to the dresses is purely cosmetic. Seeing Alisa run around in a new garb was fun. It made me excited to see what dress I could get next. If I have any complaints, it's that there aren't enough dresses. More on that later, but I think Casper himself is very proud of this aspect of the game. Probably due in part to Alisa, without a doubt, being at the very least inspired by his real-life girlfriend, who not only has a suspiciously similar name to Alisa, not only did the music to the game, not only translated the game to Japanese, but also voices the character. Something about that feels endearing to me. I don't know. On the other side of the gameplay are the puzzles, which are peppered throughout the Dollhouse and are mostly strong, if a bit basic. Much like the way the game leads you through the Dollhouse, there's a few hiccups. For example, there's an item that needs to be used in a certain room. You can tell I'm being vague here. As far as I could tell, there wasn't really any through line between the item and the room. It was early on enough in the game that I could brute force it by process of elimination, but maybe some note connecting this puzzle wouldn't hurt. There's also a puzzle involving locks and the obligatory Jill sandwich joke I see complained about online, but while I didn't finish it on the first try, I don't think it's a bad puzzle. Alisa is a game that, despite a few flaws, I'm very positive about overall. It's a game that normally I would wholeheartedly recommend. However, I have to stop right here, pump the brakes a little, and talk about the biggest caveat in recommending Alisa. Alright, here's the thing. This game is not done. I don't mean that there's no ending or anything. You can complete the game, and it's a pretty sizable adventure even. But not only will you encounter bugs along the way, it's also very clearly missing content. Let's start with the bugs and then work our way up. First of all, alright, I'm coming in during the editing process. It's been about a week since I recorded and wrote the review to this game. And in that time, Casper Croes has, I believe he squashed every single bug that I complained about in this section. I think the only one that he hasn't quite gotten yet is the hit detection. Sometimes you'll see like the HUD light up and say that you'll hit an enemy, and then the enemy won't react at all to your attacks. It's a pretty annoying bug, and I think it's still in the game. But everything else has been patched. So kudos to him for fixing up his game. And I guess we'll just continue on with the video. It certainly, however, isn't finished. For one, there were definitely weapons and dresses cut from the original release. It's as clear as day when you look at the shopkeep's inventory. There's 3 more dress slots available in the shop, the modification feature was cut entirely, and there's a few loose ends in the map, such as the well in the garden, the gate in the red room with the fireplace, and a certain scare that gets set up at the beginning of the game that's left without payoff. Hey, post-editing Tectonic here again to let you know that Casper actually did add a way to get into this well, so that's another point for Casper. At this rate, he's gonna completely finish the game by the time I'm done with this review, which I guess is a good thing. Alright, back to the video. Casper Croes explained that all this content would be cut so that the game could launch before Halloween, and for the most part, I sympathize with him. According to the Kickstarter, this game isn't his full-time job, but even still, he only got a little under $33K for it. And that's before Kickstarter's fees and Belgium's extremely high taxes. No doubt that he wanted to get the game out for Halloween. If it's a 1.0 release though, it's by the skin of its teeth. I think it would have made more sense if he released Alisa in its current state as an early access game, but that's just me. I imagine some might think I'm coming across as overly lenient or making excuses for Casper here. And while I suppose that would be correct, I do it because I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt that all of the promised content from the Kickstarter will make its way into the game. He seems genuinely passionate, and I don't think this is some sort of malicious kick scammer situation. For a game I backed on a whim over a year ago, Alisa surprised me with how well realized it was, bugs and whatnot be damned. A lot of indie games will use its inspirations as nothing more than a pastiche, and it's rare to see one commit to the throwback aesthetic in the way Alisa does. This game might be a little too hard in general for its own good, along with certain difficulty spikes that would make many players give the game up entirely. But that might just be as it is at the moment. I could see many of the difficulty complaints disappearing if there was a modern control scheme, which is promised to be added in the future. Not counting things that are supposed to make their way into the game, here are some features I would like to add to make the game more palatable. So despite some glaring flaws, I'm more than satisfied with my backing of this game. But would I recommend it to others, even in its current state? I think I would, just with some slight trepidation. If you made it through this review thinking this game looked rad as hell, then you'll probably be able to look past the flaws much like I did. Despite the obvious cuts, there's definitely $18 worth of content here, and I believe Casper will only make this game better. Hell, it's even cheaper if you get it from Itch. I'm excited to see what becomes of Alisa in the coming months. Maybe I'll even do a follow-up video when everything promised has been added. It's only uphill from here.